Thanks very much, Rob, and I do appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk about what's going on in the Nomenclature Committee. So first of all, I'll just give a very brief background about what I'm up to, and I'm putting up a Basidio on my seat here, and I know that's the other group, but every good group has a sister group, so I work on Basidio on my seats. This is my favourite genus, Lacaria. And this is my favourite method of analysis, genealogical concordance. So that's what I kind of get up to when I have my taxonomist hat on. But today I'm here mainly talking about nomenclature. So what I'm going to do is give you an update from the Nomenclature Committee for Fungi. I'm going to talk about proposed changes to the code, dovetailing in with what David's dealt with. I'm going to give a brief update on the governance subcommittee. Talk a little bit about the lists from working groups, talk about registration, and end up trying to kind of pull some threads together which really are outside the code now, talking about fungi name data integration and support. So I won't just be talking about the code, I'll be kind of ending up in some broader issues. So this is the Nomenclature Committee for Fungi. We have a committee of 20 all around the world. And as you would be aware, Lorelei Norvell, the secretary previous to myself, unfortunately due to her illness, we had a sort of hiatus in the operation of the committee. Lorelei was an exceptionally efficient secretary and ran a very busy slate of work, and I've taken up the reins from her, and I'm sort of trying to get things back up to speed. So we have a committee that we rarely meet in person. In fact, I don't think we've ever sat down around a table and met in person. And we have a very large workload to deal with. So the kind of things that we have on the plate at the moment are the individual proposals to conserve or reject, requests for binding decisions about particular cases that need resolution, registration. We have a formal role under the code to approve the repositories for registration, and we also have a role now in dealing with the lists from working groups. The code itself is changed by debate at a nomenclature section of an International Botanical Congress, so it's not the Nomenclature Committee for Fungi that makes the changes to the code. We may be asked for our opinion about particular issues. Individual members of the committee may be involved in making the proposals, but the code is changed by people publishing proposals prior to the Congress to change the code. Now, in trying to manage the business, we had about 60 proposals on the books when I took over as secretary, some of which have been around for quite a while. So I'm really trying to introduce a system now that we can respond a lot more quickly. So we have a Google group, we have various kind of areas within that. We have a separate thread for every individual proposal or any item of business that we need to deal with. And for each individual item, here's a particular proposal to do with Taiwan fungus. We have the discussion thread so we can follow everything. It's all there. I don't need to be photocopying things and sending out different emails. And I think that's kind of improved the speed at which we can react to things and the ability to follow the arguments. We have a whole range of different proposals. This, in fact, is an example of the kind of importance of having a nomenclature committee. This is a very important, economically important fungus in Asia, and it is a multi-million-dollar industry around this particular fungus, Ganoderma camphoratum. And there is a discussion about the type and some rather complicated details there. So there's industry bodies, there's a lot of need to decide. Now, we've had this on the books for quite a while, and it would be ideal in these cases to react much more quickly. And that's what I would hope we will be able to do once we catch up with the business, because this is not some abstruse argument about something that went on hundreds of years ago. It's actually very important to get that name locked, because there's some disputes there about what the correct name is, and the industry just want to, as David puts it, get on with it and know what name to use. So this is one of the more important proposals we have. I've also instituted a system of online voting with very strict deadlines, midnight in Melbourne, wherever that is in the world, and in order to kind of get through the business, because with the number of proposals we have and with the list for the working groups coming, we have to be able to get on and get these things decided quite efficiently. So I can keep track of what the level of support is. We have a rule that we need a 60% support for any individual proposal. We have 2 rounds of voting, so we can get a sort of sense of where we are, and then proposals that have sufficient support go on. So I took up the reins about a month or 2 after the IMC, and by December we got through 20 of the proposals that were on the books, and I'll be writing a report for IMA Fungus and Taxon about that shortly. So we got through 1/3 of the business already. The more difficult things are remaining. But I think with these things like Google Groups and the online voting, we should be able to respond a lot more quickly, and I would anticipate down the track that someone could publish a proposal and maybe within a matter of weeks we should be able to make a decision in some cases, or months. So I want to really pull it down from the years that we've sort of spun out to. This is probably sort of a little bit stereotypical of what you might think the committee is dealing with. Some very old Italian text where we're needing to interpret the precise wording here. But I think it's important that you've got some group of people who are willing to deal with these things and make the decision and get the clarity. So this is a case where really it comes down to, which is the button here. So this is Catalaria, a name introduced by Acarius at an infrageneric rank, taken up by Massalongo as a genus, and there's an argument as to whether the type should be attached to the original subgenus, and was it a transfer to the generic rank, or was Massalongo introducing a new name? And because the priority is only within ranks, if he was introducing a new name, the type sticks with his interpretation. And it came down to working out what on earth affato opposto means. Affato is not a word that people in modern Italian are so familiar with. It could mean various things, and could mean not, and it could be a double negative, but in fact we've taken some advice and we think it means absolutely. So Massalongo was saying that he was deliberately taking up the generic name Catalaria, deliberately in a sense absolutely opposite to Acarius. So it's sorted, and it's good to just have a committee that can deal with that, sort it out, and we'll make the decision on that. But I don't want you to think that's the kind of thing we're always dealing with. We're also looking for elegant solutions to nomenclature problems and assisting the taxonomic community. So this was a nice case where there was a proposal here to conserve Coniothecium, which was threatened against the earliest synonym Torulus tilbospora, which had been introduced by Corder in one work in Sturm, but later in the Iconies he himself used it in a different sense. And this is a sense that had been widely used. So in fact, when there's a perfectly good type specimen, when it was examined, it was found to be not synonymous. So the proposal came in to conserve it, and we realised that in fact both of these fungi are in common use, and a more elegant solution would be to actually conserve Torula with the type attached to the later interpretation. So we're able to reduce the number of name changes there just by an application of the rules. So this is not a controversial solution, but in fact the back and forth with the proposer, we try and work closely with the people who make proposals, get more information, assist maybe a more elegant solution. We're also asked for binding recommendations, and this is one of the extremely thorny issues that we've been given. This was the first fungal name to be registered. It was registered at several seconds after midnight on the 1st of January 2012, and we have been asked to make a ruling on whether or not this descriptive statement here actually constitutes a description or a diagnosis. And as you can see there, it's a little statement about the least inclusive clade containing certain organisms with gene bank accessions and so on. So someone has published this name. It's unclear to the community as to whether this is actually a valid publication, and indeed whether this is a procedure to be followed in general. And so I think this is quite important to clear this up, make a ruling on this. The citation of a gene bank number is, even though you think, oh, in GenBank there's a sequence, well, that's descriptive. that GenBank is not an effective place for publication of descriptive information. And so merely citing a GenBank number is not providing a descriptive information. If you in the prologue cite the DNA sequence, that's perfectly good. I like that. Position 32 is characterised by an A. That is a perfectly okay descriptive statement. So we're going to have to mull over that and make a ruling. So we're assisting the general, I guess more the scientific taxonomic community in establishing kind of procedures there. So change in the code is possible. I think many mycologists were quite shocked by the results of the Melbourne Congress, not from the point of view of not being happy with the results, but the fact that we made such good progress. So the name of the code was changed to Algae, Fungi and Plants. And I think this has been a very significant change in recognising the true biological diversity. It's also a great example now to take to textbooks, to university courses, to committees, to wherever, and say the code recognises that there are algae, fungi and plants, so your legislation should, your teaching should, and so on. And I'm using this a lot now to say we need to get into a 21st century classification of life, and fungi are not plants. We were able to bring in Latin or English, electronic publication, a long history of attempts through special committees to get that in, and of course one name, one fungus. So congresses can affect change, and there will be no doubt further changes at the next Congress and thereafter. So David has talked about some of the more complicated or issues that need some wider debate in terms of changes to the code that were supported strongly by mycologists at the last International Mycological Congress. There are a number that are pretty uncontroversial. This block here, registering later typifications, great idea. Very difficult to find epitypifications, lectotypifications in the literature. The proposal is that you would just be issued with a number and you'd have to put that into a repository. For epitates, removing this phrase demonstrably ambiguous, meaning that you have to try to get a DNA sequence out of it in order to then say I didn't succeed and therefore an epitype is possible. Recommending to include a diagnosis. Ban the introduction of cross-kingdom homonyms. Remove the priority of the teleomorph names. This is just dreadfully complicated. Article 57.2. We've already had many sort of Monty Python-like moments in the committee of saying, so you have to propose a name to be rejected, then we have to reject it. So does that mean we vote yes or no? And in fact, we've had a vote on Gary Samuel's proposal and people were so confused, everyone voted yes. And I had to say, no, he wants you to vote no. So it's impossible. And David's quite correct. I mean, it's gone. So that's fine. And it just needs to be officially enacted at the next Congress. Some changes in the terminology for the lists from the working groups using this name, protected. So I would regard them as all totally uncontroversial and there's wide support and they should be fine. And I think one of the things that really helped in Melbourne was being out, even though there was a relatively small number of mycologists, maybe 10 or 15 present at the Congress, where we were able to get up and say these proposals, particularly the one name, one fungus, they have support from the mycological community. We could quote the voting and we could say with our hands on our hearts, this is strongly supported. So I think that these proposals, we can go and do the same thing and it should not be a problem. I do think I kind of put this one in orange. I do think some further debate about these one dealing with the two names with the same epithet might be useful, if only I think to make the case. I think at least that needs some more discussion and presentation of the arguments, but that certainly is one that there's a little bit more discussion around that. I just thought I'd throw in the possibility of DNA sequences for new names. You could imagine writing a recommendation or a rule. Remember the code. You can either have a rule that you have to follow or a recommendation that encourages a good practice. So this is just some words I dashed off thinking, well, how would it work? You'd need the barcode sequence or a secondary barcode where they might be approved by the groups who haven't actually done that yet. But I think the problem with this is that this is taxonomy, not nomenclature. So I think I'd like to test this by putting forward the proposal, taking it to the Congress. But I actually think This is about science and how you do the science. So I think certainly we need to strongly recommend that people are doing this. It's best practice. Obviously, not all organisms at the moment can we get the DNA out and so on. So the code does regulate nomenclature. So I think this is more the scientific community regulating taxonomy by peer review, by best practice, by graduate supervisors and so on. But it would be good to test the waters on this a bit, and then maybe it would become clear that this is maybe more the purview of the ICTF rather than the code. Briefly, in terms of governance of the code with respect to fungi, I'm chairing a special subcommittee on that, which is a subcommittee of another committee which is dealing with governance of the code in general. And at present, it's only confirmation of registration authorities that is under the IMC, but the opinions of the mycological community were crucial. So within this special subcommittee, I think it's fair to say that we have majority support for moving the governance of the code to the IMC, which would also mean that the appointment of the Nomenclature Committee for Fungi would be the responsibility of the IMC and the IMA rather than the Botanical Congress. So this change to the code, we will write a proposal, it will be out there before Shenzhen. This change to the code could be enacted at Shenzhen, in which case the 2018 IMC would have a nomenclature section which would have a mandate. So we have two possible roadmaps there, maybe 2023 if we don't get it up, but I think I would say there is a very good chance of this change being made, so that the mycologists would be making the decisions on the matters in the code that pertain solely to fungi. In terms of the working groups, the code introduced the provision to set up working groups to deal initially for the one name, one fungus issue, because it was realised that there would be numerous names that would need to be dealt with. But actually there's nothing in the code that says that's the only thing that a working group could do. And I think this has been a really superb work that's gone on. The groups were set up, they've been working through, there's a lot of consensus. We already have a number of publications that have indicated the choice of names. So I think it's actually a great example of how the community can actually work to very quickly work through issues that were seen to be perhaps by some people insurmountable. These are the different working groups. The procedure is that there needs to be just some formal ratification, almost sort of after the horse has left the stable, by the NCF and the ICTF. And now over the next couple of months we'll be gearing up with the working groups in terms of progress reports, trying to activate groups that might just need a little bit of a prod. We also now need to provide a preferred format for how the list of names that are arising out of the working groups are going to go into the code. So we need to just work that out. Then we'll provide that to the working groups and then be collating probably what will be a master list of the whole lot in one big hit for publication in IMA Fungus. And remember, of course, that with the working groups, many of the decisions don't need now any formal nomenclatural action. If the decision was to adopt the earliest teleomorph name, there is no action required. That's the name that's correct under the code. So we just need to perhaps indicate that some of these that don't require action, and then the ones that do require action, they will go en masse to the NCF, and I don't anticipate that there would be too much fiddling. There may just need to be some tidying up of citations and so on, but it's not seen that there would be another whole kind of opening up of that. That's the idea. And particularly because these come from working groups which have very wide representation, there's a very strong case that that's the decision. So we're not intending to be opening these up. And then it will be signed off at the IBC in 2017. But very importantly, there remains the opportunity for new groups to be set up. A new group recently was set up for phytopathogenic fungi, so names of high economic importance where the user community wants some certainty. I can imagine just discussions that we've had over tea in the last week or so, that we could, for example, set up a working group to fix the gender of genera. It's a rather obscure area. There's some doubt as to what exactly the gender of some genera is. Jos Stalpers has been doing a lot of work behind the scenes on this. Would be possible just to make a list and say this is the gender. No one is going to argue now whether eucalyptus is masculine or feminine or whatever it might be, because you can waste a lot of time on that. I also think there might be the opportunity to take the list of sanction names. It's actually quite difficult to have an exact list of what names did Fries and Persson sanction. There's some doubt about the index and what happens if it's different between the first volume and the second volume. Walter Gams has prepared a list. Lee Crane has prepared a list. Joost also has a list. Maybe we just get that list, tidy it up, then that is the list. No one can ever go back and say, but the footnote on page 53 says this. And in fact, that may mean that we could remove sanctioning from the code, which is a sort of an anomaly for fungi, because that entire list of names could just be protected in the same way that other lists from working groups. So these are possibilities under the rules that are available. Now, in terms of repositories, we now have compulsory registration of new names, new combinations of fungi. There are 3 repositories that are approved by the NCF: Mycobank, Index Fungorum, and Fungi Names. And all of you will be familiar who publish new names of how this operates. There are some small issues about registration in terms of misciting of identifiers. Pretty much any mistake that you could imagine has now been made. Probably there are some we can't imagine that will also be made. But I think these are fairly minor issues. We may need to change the code to make it clearer how to deal with those mistakes. And there's also some difficulties about the authors not going back and releasing the names and putting the details in, and we need to sort of maybe make some assessments. So I think it would be useful to have some reporting now from the repositories about how this is going, and I'm working closely with the repositories on that. And here's an example where a new genus is introduced and a new species, and they're both assigned the same number. So only one of these can be correct, and the other one is not valid. And there are all sorts of other situations, and I think we just need to write something that clarifies how to deal with these situations. There's 2 views on where a number's miscited. So say a digit is transposed, maybe it's just a correctable error, or maybe it's an invalid name that needs a validation. So these are things that weren't quite imagined when registration came in. We will tidy that up. One thing I'm keen to encourage is that if the mycological community has to put stuff into the repository, including the description, we should be able to get it out again. So not all the repositories make available in a searchable format everything that you put in. So that would be a simple change to the code. Because that was the whole point of registration, was that we didn't have to look for stuff. And yes, many journals are available electronically, but some are behind a paywall. So if we are forced to put the description in, we should be able to get it out again. You can, in the Fungi Names registration site, do that, but not in all the other repositories. Now, the main issue is synchronisation. So we have this famous or infamous diagram here that was part of a memorandum of cooperation that was signed when the registration authorities were set up. And this synchronisation, basically what's meant to happen is that if there are 2 or more repositories with names going into them independently, they should be immediately, daily, information flowing back and forth. Because if the synchronisation happens every year or however long, then someone can be depositing a name here and it's not even realised that a homonym is deposited over here. So it's highly unsatisfactory not to have synchronisation. It was part of the memorandum. And I should say I'm sort of here on a diplomatic mission. I have spent a day at Mycobank learning about the operation of Mycobank, talking to the curators. I will be going to Kew and carrying out the same exercise with Index Fungorum, and I will be also making a communication with Yijiang Yao in Beijing to just discuss how things are going. So I don't want to really say too much, but I could say we're somewhere between this situation, this situation, which I think is sort of just studied disengagement, so still not really ideal, but at least, and where we want to go is here. Now, it's sort of hard to find pictures of knights shaking hands on the internet, but this is actually what they're doing, so that's what we want. And I think it's really important to get this sorted, and the NCF has the responsibility for approving the repositories or withdrawing that approval, and I think what comes with that is also a role in making sure it's working. Now that was the hard bit, the people bit. This is the easy bit, the database bit. So just want to end up briefly talking a little bit about that. I want to make a distinction between nomenclature. So a nomenclature, not a word you hear very often, is a list of all the names, their status under the code, whether they're effectively published, valid, legitimate and so on, their author citations, their types. Homotypic names are linked absolutely by having the same type. You can't break that connection. And one version of a nomenclature is sufficient. There should be one version in the world of the nomenclature for fungi. There is no point for anyone in the world to be maintaining a nomenclature of fungi anymore. It must be up to date. And there is significant curation required, both for the new things, and I think this is something I want to bring out in the reports from the repositories. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to clean up names, to assist authors in complying with the code, and there's a huge work to clean up the legacy names that were there before registration came in. This is quite different to taxonomy. Taxonomy is where there's a choice to link between heterotypic names, where there's a choice about the placement of a name within a higher ranked name, which genus to put it in, and so on. Taxonomies change over time, and there can be multiple taxonomies. We could also envisage an agreed taxonomy. So for the working groups, say the phytopathogenic fungi, that would be an agreed taxonomy. And we could imagine a situation where the latest classification is automatically adopted in agreed taxonomy unless there's a group that says that that shouldn't be the case. So I think there's a poor understanding in the general user community of the difference between a nomenclature and a taxonomy, as for example implemented in Index Fungorum, Species Fungorum, and the same in Mycobank. There is both a nomenclature and a taxonomy. And we could imagine an efficient system will be a single or a very tightly synchronised world fungi names database, which is the nomenclature. And then we could also have a world fungi checklist using the working groups, curators, or defaulting to the latest taxonomy. Now, I just want to introduce in the last minute or two the idea of paying for this. I think a lot of this nomenclature work going on behind the scenes is not valued because we don't put money on it. There is thousands of hours being contributed within the NCF, within the curators of some of the repositories. Some of that is paid for by institutions. But until we value that, I don't think people just assume that will happen. So I like to propose the idea of a global fungi name fund, a trust fund that is set up under the IMA that has a list of specifications for what the mycological community wants, and that fund, €2 million should raise enough interest to fund something like that to start with, and that fund lets a contract for the maintenance of the global nomenclature and the taxonomy if that's desirable. I'll just quickly put that up, and the main point here is that we just want one nomenclature. At the moment, many regional fungi names databases are themselves checking all these names as well. If there was a single fungi global nomenclature, we could, with synchronisation and web services, we could all just pull it. And that would save millions of dollars. It's truly millions of dollars. In Australia, we have spent almost $1 million on our name database. In New Zealand, significant resources have been spent. In the US, in Britain, in Sweden, there's a lot of money being spent on just the names. So I really think it's time to kind of make a more efficient system for that. And people have this idea that the registration indexing authorities that have all these bevies of people working behind the scenes doing all this work. It's not the case. It's often just a couple of people there. So I think we need to value that, we need to recognise that, put a value on it and try and fund that. So in conclusion, the Nomenclature Committee for Fungi is there to assist taxonomists with nomenclature. If you have any problems, get in touch with us. We can assist you with the preparation of proposals. If you have a proposal, we're very keen to work with you on refining or going back and forth. Code changes are possible and governance changes at the IMC is likely. The registration issues need to be resolved, and I think it's time to assess the structure and funding of the optimum global fungi name system. Thank you.